By early 1944, when USS Barb, SS-220, slipped out of Pearl Harbor on another patrol, no one in the Pacific Fleet yet understood that this unassuming Gato-class submarine would soon become the most unpredictable, most aggressive, and most creatively dangerous vessel the U.S. Navy had ever sent into Japanese waters. Other submarines stalked convoys, fired torpedoes from the shadows, and avoided unnecessary risks. Barb, under the command of Commander Eugene Bennett Fluckey, seemed determined to do the opposite. Fluckey believed a submarine was not a weapon of caution, but of opportunity, and that any target, anywhere, was fair game if the execution was clever enough. His patrol reports became infamous, not just for the number of ships sunk, but for the sheer audacity of the tactics employed. He piloted Barb into places most submarine commanders considered suicidal: shallow bays, mined harbors, and coastal waters so tight that surface ships could run aground. Fluckey treated the Japanese coast not as a forbidden zone, but as a hunting ground waiting to be mapped. When Fluckey took command in January 1944, Barb had already completed several patrols, but she had not yet become legendary. That transformation began with Fluckey's first decision: to push his crew harder, think faster, and take risks no submarine manual had ever endorsed. His philosophy was blunt: hit them where they don't expect a submarine to be. That single sentence defined everything Barb did for the next 18 months. Instead of firing from maximum range, Barb pressed close, sometimes terrifyingly close, to enemy convoys. Instead of retreating after a torpedo strike, she surfaced in the middle of panicked escorts and finished crippled ships with her 5-inch deck gun. Instead of slipping away after being detected, she outran pursuing destroyers at flank speed on the surface. Fluckey turned a submarine into a knife fighter, and the crew trusted him with fanatical loyalty. The war in the Pacific offered endless chances for boldness. By 1944, Japan depended on vast supply lines, stretching from the oil fields of Sakhalin and Hokkaido to the factories of Honshu. The Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to protect convoys as American submarines, armed with reliable torpedoes at last, spread across the East China Sea. Barb joined this offensive with enthusiasm, but while other skippers sought opportunities, Fluckey created them. He studied charts for shallow bays where ships hid at night. He noted refueling points. He memorized coastal schedules, and he demanded his submarine go faster, stay longer, strike harder. He was not reckless. He was methodical and daring in equal measure. On patrol after patrol, Barb pushed into waters that seemed impossible for a submarine. Near the Ryukyus, she crept within 900 yards of enemy destroyers. At Kyushu, she penetrated a coastal shipping lane only 60 feet deep. When the risk of mines, patrol craft, and aircraft would have stopped other captains cold, Fluckey pressed on. His superiors watched Barb's reports with mounting astonishment. Even among the submarine force, already home to some of the boldest officers in the U.S. Navy, Fluckey stood apart. His patrols were not just successful, they were theatrical. He once surfaced in the middle of a convoy at night, racing between ships at 19 knots as torpedoes detonated on both sides. He fired spreads so close that the crew could hear the screws of torpedoes spinning in the water. He ordered flank speed while still submerged, an act that nearly tore the hull apart just to escape depth charges. But what stunned Japanese commanders most in these early months was not the individual attacks, it was the pattern. Reports from coastal stations indicated a submarine behaving in ways that contradicted Japanese expectations. They believed American submarines avoided shallow water. Barb embraced it. They believed submarines would never risk closing to deck gun range under searchlights. Barb did it repeatedly. They believed submarines fled when detected. Barb sometimes advanced instead. By late 1944, Japanese naval intelligence began circulating internal advisories warning that a bold enemy submarine commander was operating along the Sakhalin and Hokkaido coasts. They had no name, no hull number, just scattered reports of a phantom sub that appeared where no submarine should be, struck with clinical precision, and vanished before escorts could respond. What they did not know was that Flucky was just getting started. USS Barb's 7th and 8th war patrols would become some of the most successful in submarine history, sinking fully loaded transports, ammunition ships, and tankers critical to Japan's survival. Every patrol expanded Flucky's appetite for innovation. When torpedoes were unavailable or wasteful, he used rockets. When a convoy hugged the shore, he close to insane proximity to fire point blank. When Japanese escorts thought they had cornered him, he ran toward them at full speed on the surface, playing a deadly game of chicken until they broke formation. By early 1945, Barb was no longer just another submarine. She was a predator, engineered by imagination, a vessel whose commander believed that the rules of naval warfare existed mostly to be bent, twisted, or ignored. The U.S. Navy would eventually recognize Flucky's genius by awarding him the Medal of Honor. But even before that, sailors across the Pacific whispered about Barb. She was the submarine that defied doctrine, that refused to act like a submarine, and that attacked in places submarines had no business being. All of this set the stage for the moment that would shock the Imperial Japanese Navy more than any torpedo strike, more than any convoy ambush, more than any coastal bombardment. Because USS Barb would soon do something no submarine in history had ever done. She would attack the Japanese home islands on land.
By the beginning of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was fighting a losing battle not only at sea but along the lifelines that fed the home islands. Convoys carrying coal from Sakhalin, oil from Hokkaido, raw materials from Manchuria, and food from Korea were the last arteries keeping Japan alive as American submarines tightened a noose around the empire. And into this collapsing logistical network came the USS Barb, no longer just a daring submarine, but a force of disruption, specifically engineered by Commander Eugene Flucky to cut, sever, and shatter Japan's remaining economic lifeblood. The East China Sea, once considered a relatively safe operating area for Japanese merchant shipping, grew deadly the moment Barb entered it. Flucky treated every convoy report not as a defensive challenge, but as an opportunity to test the outer limits of submarine warfare. His approach was simple and terrifyingly effective. Close distance fast, fire torpedoes from impossibly short ranges, surface amid chaos, and finish whatever remained afloat with gunnery or demolition charges. The Japanese convoy system, already strained by shortages of escort ships and fuel, could not withstand this kind of pressure. During Barb's 7th War Patrol, Flucky executed one of the most brilliant attacks of the entire submarine campaign. On the night of 23 January 1945, Barb infiltrated a heavily protected convoy inside Nam Quan Harbor, a place most submarine commanders considered untouchable due to shallow depths and patrol boats. Flucky drove Barb into the harbor at flank speed, weaving through minefields, and came within 3,000 yards of shore before launching a perfectly placed spread of torpedoes. The results were catastrophic for Japan. Several transports and tankers erupted in flames, bursting into pillars of fire that illuminated the coastline like a burning skyline. Japanese escorts tried to pursue, but the harbor was too chaotic, too shallow, and too filled with their own wreckage to mount an organized defense. Flucky then fled at 20.5 knots, setting a submerged speed record for the Gato class, a speed so high the submarine nearly shook itself apart. It was a miracle escape, and it became the centerpiece of the action for which Flucky later received the Medal of Honor. What truly stunned Japanese commanders was not just the destruction itself, but how Barb made her attacks unpredictable. One day she was hunting deep-sea convoys, the next she was firing her deck gun at shore facilities, the next she was stalking small fishing junks used as picket boats. The Japanese tried to adjust, but their defensive networks were overstretched. With aircraft grounded by fuel shortages and destroyers tied to critical escort duties, they had little left to counter a submarine commander willing to take such colossal risks. Among Barb's many kills during this period was the Unkai Maru No. 3, a large ammunition ship whose destruction sent a shockwave of fire into the sky on 8 January 1945. The explosion was visible for miles along the Chinese coast. When reports reached Tokyo Naval Headquarters, officers struggled to understand how an American submarine had penetrated a convoy screen, executed a high-speed surface withdrawal, and escaped multiple depth charge barrages. Barb was beginning to achieve something rare: psychological dominance. Convoy captains reported that crews were nervous, jittery, and prone to false alarms. Some ships refused to travel at night. Others hugged the shoreline so closely that their hulls risked grounding. But hugging the shoreline played directly into Flucky's strategy. He realized early in 1945 that if he wanted to maximize destruction, he had to go where Japanese ships felt safest, right next to the coast, protected by narrow bays and coastal batteries. Most submarine commanders avoided these areas because they offered no room to dive or maneuver, but Flucky studied tides, read coastal charts meticulously, and trusted his crew's ability to react instantly. In return, Barb hunted convoys at point-blank ranges, where even Japanese sailors watching from shore could see her silhouette against the waves. By the spring of 1945, Barb's reputation had grown so large that Japanese naval intelligence circulated warnings of an exceptionally aggressive Allied submarine operating between Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the northern Sea of Japan. They believed it might even be a special experimental vessel, because no ordinary submarine commander would dare approach the home island so closely. Yet the truth was simpler. The Japanese were facing a commander who understood that the best way to break an enemy's will was to destroy not just ships, but confidence. Every tanker that burst into flames, every cargo ship that disappeared beneath the water, every convoy disrupted by panic was another blow to a Japanese war machine already on the brink of starvation. Still, even as Barb's torpedoes and deck gun wreaked havoc across Japan's northern supply lines, Flucky believed he could go further. He had crippled convoys. He had penetrated harbors. He had outpaced destroyers. But to truly shock Japan, to strike a blow that would echo from Tokyo to every fishing village along the empire's northern edge, he needed to do something no submarine had ever attempted. He needed to take the war onto Japanese soil. And soon, as Barb approached Sakhalin in July 1945, the opportunity would appear: a single railway line hugging the shore, carrying troop trains and supplies southward. A target so audacious, so unconventional, and so unthinkable that even the U.S. Navy had never imagined a submarine could hit it. Barb and Flucky would prove them wrong.
By July 1945, as USS Barb pushed north along the coasts of Hokkaido and Sakhalin, the nature of her patrol transformed from aggressive submarine warfare into something altogether unprecedented. Barb was no longer simply hunting ships. She was stalking the Japanese coastline itself. The submarine's recon periscope revealed fishing villages, warehouses, coal-loading piers, and rail lines running so close to the water that Flucky could see individual telegraph poles flickering past with each swell. If earlier in the war American submarines had fought far offshore, now Barb was operating at arm's length from the home islands, in waters so tight and shallow that a single wrong maneuver could have thrown the submarine onto the rocks. But Flucky seemed energized by the danger. The closer he got to Japan, the more aggressively his mind searched for targets. Japanese commanders had long believed their northern coastline was effectively immune to submarine attack. The labyrinth of reefs and shoals around Sakhalin, combined with tidal patterns and heavy fog, created natural barriers. On top of that, shore batteries, patrol craft, and picket boats were stationed specifically to deter enemy vessels. But those defenses were built on the assumption that no submarine commander would willingly risk operating within visual range of coastal villages. The ocean floor along Sakhalin dropped unevenly. Depths shifted from 300 feet to less than 30 feet in minutes. Radar detectors were limited. Coastal waters offered almost no room for a submerged submarine to turn. Yet Barb moved through this environment
with a confidence that shocked even her own crew. On 18 July 1945, Barb intercepted a coastal convoy near Sakhalin and fired a spread of torpedoes at close range, sinking the Hakuai Maru, a Japanese tanker vital to the northern fuel supply chain. But it was what Flucky did next that terrified local Japanese commanders. He did not flee. Instead, once darkness settled, he surfaced and brought Barb directly into the shoreline traffic lanes. The crew on the bridge could see lights from houses and station lanterns through the fog. Some sailors later recalled they could smell burning coal drifting across the water. The submarine was so close that even fishing vessels docked along the coast would not have believed an American warship was lurking just outside their breakwaters. Barb's radar began sweeping the coastline for small vessels, rail depots, and stationary targets that could be hit with the submarine's deck gun or rockets. This was another shock for the Japanese. Barb was one of the first U.S. submarines equipped with shore bombardment rockets, a field modification that Flucky used with enthusiasm. On several nights, Barb surfaced and fired volleys of rockets into industrial sites along the Sakhalin coast. These attacks were so fast and so precise that villagers and soldiers thought they were under assault from destroyers or aircraft. No one imagined a submarine could or would fire rockets from point-blank range at shore positions. Everywhere Barb went, Japanese forces scrambled, misinterpreting her attacks. Shore batteries opened fire at phantom targets. Patrol craft raced blindly into fog banks. Command posts sent contradictory signals, unsure whether they were dealing with saboteurs, amphibious raiders, or a ghost ship. Reports arriving at Tokyo headquarters described explosions along the Sakhalin coastline from an unknown offshore attacker, and in one case even suggested a disguised Allied surface raider. The idea that a submarine was responsible simply did not occur to them. But Flucky was growing restless. Ships, even convoys hugging the shoreline, no longer felt challenging enough. He wanted a target that would break Japanese morale, something so audacious that its psychological impact would outweigh its physical damage. As Barb prowled the waters west of Sakhalin, he and his officers scanned coastal charts in the control room, their red-lit eyes following the curves of a thin black line, the Japanese Coastal Railway, a lifeline used to move troops south from Sakhalin into Hokkaido. From the periscope, the line was unmistakable. It ran within yards of the water, close enough that a determined swimmer could reach it. Freight trains carrying soldiers and ammunition clattered down that track every night. It was, in Flucky's mind, a target tailor-made for a new kind of submarine warfare, one that didn't just sink ships, but physically struck Japanese soil. Ideas that would never have survived in any other submarine found fertile ground aboard Barb. Flucky's officers, emboldened by months of successful risk-taking, realized this was more than a fantasy. A landing was possible. A demolition charge could be placed. A train could be destroyed. And the submarine could escape before Japanese forces even knew what had happened. As Barb cruised at periscope depth just offshore, watching the sparks from locomotive wheels blink in the night like fireflies, the plan crystallized. Flucky turned to his executive officer and said the words that would enter submarine legend. "We're going ashore." The XO stared at him. "Sir, ashore with a submarine?" Flucky smiled. "Why not? We've done everything else." Preparations began immediately. Volunteers were chosen, 8 men, agile, quiet, and unafraid of crawling across a beach patrolled by Japanese soldiers. A demolition design was drawn up, using a micro-timed switch, one that would allow the saboteurs to lay explosives under the rail line and withdraw safely before the next train arrived. The crew trained with flashlights covered in blue filters to mimic starlight. They practiced the approach, the crawl, the placement, the retreat. Every minute Barb stayed near the coastline increased the risk of detection, but Flucky stayed. He wanted the perfect moment, low tide, darkness, and a train schedule timed so that the explosion would have maximum effect. The Japanese had no idea a submarine was orchestrating an attack that would hit them not from the sea, but from the land itself. And within days, Barb would cross the boundary separating naval warfare from sabotage, making history as the only U.S. submarine in World War II to launch a ground attack on the Japanese home islands. Shortly after midnight on 22 July 1945, with the moon hidden behind dense Sakhalin clouds and the swell barely brushing the shoreline, USS Barb drifted silently offshore, engines barely turning, every man aboard holding his breath for what was about to happen. They were not preparing for a torpedo attack, nor a surface ambush, nor a rocket strike. This time, Barb was about to launch a mission no submarine in the history of naval warfare had ever attempted: a ground assault on Japan itself. 8 hand-picked sailors, later immortalized as the Barb Demolition Squad, prepared to go ashore. None of them were Marines. None were trained commandos. They were torpedo men, electricians, radio men, machinists' mates, ordinary submarine crewmen transformed by months under Flucky into men ready to crawl onto enemy soil with nothing but knives, pliers, and explosives. Their objective was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution: sabotage the coastal railway between Kashiho and Kutani, a crucial line used to shuttle troops and supplies from Sakhalin toward the home islands. The track ran only a few dozen yards from the water, protected by patrols and watchtowers. A misstep meant capture or execution. The Japanese believed this coastline was secure. They believed the surf itself was their shield. What they did not know was that Barb stood only a few hundred yards offshore, black against the nighttime swell, with engines cut to silence. Commander Eugene Flucky supervised from the bridge, scanning the coastline with binoculars wrapped in canvas to prevent accidental reflections. He had created the plan, refined it, and rehearsed it, yet he refused to lead the landing himself. "I'm the captain," he told his XO. "My job is to bring them home." Instead, he placed Lieutenant J.G. William Walker in charge of the shore party, along with 7 enlisted men: Paul Sanders, Bill Hatfield, Harold Augerson, Francis Seve, Lawrence Newland, Lloyd Lacey, and Edward Knapp. These were sailors who had volunteered without hesitation, some reportedly stepping forward before Flucky finished asking the question. The surf was gentle but unpredictable. Waves could drag a man sideways into the rocks or push him into the open, where a guard might see him. The 8 saboteurs waited at Barb's forward torpedo hatch as the crew inflated a small rubber boat. They wore blackened uniforms. Their boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Their demolition kit, placed carefully inside a watertight container, held a micro-timed switch, explosive blocks, and a pressure-sensitive trigger designed by Flucky himself to ensure the bomb detonated only when a train passed overhead. At 1:30 a.m., they pushed off. The rubber boat drifted toward the shore, its dark silhouette nearly indistinguishable from the breaking waves. Every few seconds, the men paused oars and listened. No shouts, no footsteps, only wind and the distant cry of seabirds. When the boat grounded on the sand, they hauled it above the tide line and moved inland, crawling on hands and knees across the narrow stretch of beach until they reached the embankment. From the top of the dune, they saw the railway line running beside a telegraph pole whose wires hummed faintly in the cold night air. The guards were nowhere in sight. The only sounds were insects, waves, and the distant rumble of a locomotive somewhere down the line, an ominous reminder that time was not an ally. The demolition squad split into pairs. 2 men kept watch. 2 prepared the workspace by clearing small stones from the rail ties. 4 began assembling the charge. They worked in near blackness, illuminated only by blue-filtered flashlights that produced a faint glow invisible from more than a dozen yards away. The device was elegant and deadly, a long metal clamp designed to fit beneath the rail, connected to a thin charge packed with high-velocity explosive. The pressure trigger was calibrated to detonate under the weight of a passing train, but not under the weight of a walking guard. As they tightened the final bolts, one of the lookouts froze. Footsteps. A voice. Somewhere beyond a stand of trees, a Japanese sentry was walking his route. The saboteurs held their breath as the guard's lantern arc swept across the ground not 50 yards away. He paused, muttered something, and turned back, never knowing that 8 American sailors lay flat on the dirt, hearts pounding, just seconds from discovery. At 2:45 a.m., the charge was in place. The men double-checked the clamp, buried the leads, and smoothed the soil. Only one more task remained, placing the timing switch. This was the riskiest moment. The switch was sensitive enough that a stumble or dropped component could detonate the device prematurely. But the crew worked with perfect discipline. When the switch clicked into its locked position, the mission was complete. They slipped back to the beach, pushed the rubber boat into the surf, and paddled furiously toward Barb, whose silhouette rose like a black dagger against the faint horizon. When the saboteurs climbed aboard, drenched and shivering, Flucky greeted each man with a handshake and a whisper. Well done. But the mission was not over, not until the train came. At 4 a.m., as Barb submerged just offshore to watch through her periscope, the night was pierced by the distant clatter of a locomotive. It grew louder, the rails vibrated. The reflection of a headlamp streaked across the water. When the troop train reached the sabotage point, the pressure trigger crushed inward. The explosion that followed lit the coastline like lightning. A fireball erupted upward, sending debris and rail fragments skyward. The locomotive buckled, cars stacked on top of each other like crumpled tin, and the shockwave rolled across the water toward Barb. Inside the submarine's control room, sailors cheered, quietly at first, then with unrestrained joy. They had done what no submarine crew in the history of naval warfare had ever attempted: a ground assault on Japan itself. Japanese commanders were furious and bewildered. Early reports claimed a band of elite commandos had attacked the track. Others claimed partisans or saboteurs from a fishing vessel. Not one Japanese intelligence officer suspected that an American submarine had put 8 men ashore in the dead of night. For Barb, the mission was complete, but her legend had just begun. When the sun rose over Sakhalin on the morning of 22 July 1945, Japanese soldiers and local railway workers stood in stunned silence before a scene that seemed to defy logic. A 16-car military train, troop cars, ammunition wagons, supply coaches, lay splintered across the tracks like a child's toy smashed against a wall. The locomotive had been hurled sideways off the embankment. Steel rails had twisted upward like boiled wire. Timber sleepers had been blown into the trees. No one could understand how an explosion of such power had occurred with no warning and no sighting of enemy forces. Within hours, military police issued competing theories. Some officers blamed anti-Japanese partisans. Others insisted it had to be a suicide attack by infiltrators from the Soviet border. One regional commander even argued that a Japanese munitions wagon must have detonated accidentally. The idea that a U.S. submarine had landed 8 men on their own coastline and destroyed a railway line was so far outside their expectations that it did not even appear in early reports. And Tokyo Naval Headquarters, when briefed that the explosion had occurred less than 100 yards from the ocean, dismissed any maritime involvement entirely. As one senior officer wrote, no submarine could get that close. But while Japanese authorities argued in circles, USS Barb was already gone. Commander Eugene Flucky had no intention of lingering near Sakhalin after the blast. The moment the plume of fire erupted inland, Barb turned south at full power, slicing through the dark waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, engines roaring at a pace usually reserved for emergency maneuvers. Her wake glowed silver beneath the early dawn as she put distance between herself and the coastline she had just violated so spectacularly. Within hours, she was beyond the range of Japanese patrol craft. Within a day, she was clear of any threat. By the time confused Japanese investigators began probing the blast crater, Barb was hundreds of miles away, safely submerged, her crew still celebrating the impossible. Life aboard the submarine following the operation carried a kind of electric disbelief. Sailors who had spent the night wiring explosives now sat in the mess drinking coffee, recounting how close a sentry's lantern had come to exposing them. Torpedo men who had fired rockets at coastal facilities days earlier now listened to the demolition squad describe the feel of Japanese soil beneath their palms as they crawled toward the tracks. Men who had sunk convoys and outsmarted destroyers now joked that they had become the first submarine infantry. Flucky, always modest, downplayed the mission in his report. He called it a small demolition operation. But no one in the Pacific Fleet was fooled. When Barb returned to Midway and later to Pearl Harbor, the base erupted in applause. Officers from other submarines shook hands with the saboteurs as though greeting war heroes. Staff from Submarine Force Pacific, COMSUBPAC, read the patrol log twice to ensure they had not misunderstood. A submarine putting a landing party ashore on Japanese territory sounded like fiction, not official naval history. Yet the evidence was unambiguous. Barb's 8th Patrol became one of the most decorated in the entire war. Her battle flag, already marked with icons representing sunk ships, received a new emblem no other submarine in the world carried: a railway track with an exploding locomotive. It remains one of the most iconic submarine insignias in U.S. Navy history. Meanwhile, the psychological fallout on the Japanese side was enormous. The Japanese Navy had spent years assuring coastal communities that their shorelines were secure. They believed submarines attacked ships, not infrastructure, that the home islands were protected by geography, that shallow bays, fog, and minefields created a natural wall. Barb shattered that illusion in one night. Reports of the explosion triggered panic in regional commands. Patrols were doubled. Coastal radars were put on high alert. Thousands of soldiers were reassigned to guard rail lines, bridges, and ports. But none of it mattered. The war was weeks from ending. And even if Japan had acted sooner, they could never have predicted, prepared for, or countered a submarine commander willing to do the unthinkable. As the empire collapsed in August 1945, Japanese officers conducting final strategic analyses noted a single unnerving trend. U.S. forces were striking not just fleets and factories, but morale itself. Barb's raid was listed quietly, almost grudgingly, as evidence that the Americans had achieved complete operational freedom around the home islands. That phrase, once unthinkable, summed up Japan's strategic nightmare. For the men of Barb, however, the meaning was more personal. They had survived depth charges, storms, convoy battles, harbors sown with mines. They had sunk ships, eluded destroyers, and outrun torpedoes. And in the final days of the war, they had done something no submarine crew had done before or since. They had taken the war to Japan's soil, come ashore, struck hard, and vanished like ghosts. Flucky's Medal of Honor citation would praise his daring at Nanquan Harbor, but among submariners, his greatest legacy would always be the Sakhalin Rain. It proved that imagination was a weapon, audacity a strategy, and that one submarine, commanded by one man who refused to fight conventionally, could terrify an entire navy. USS Barb ended the war as one of the most successful and most fearsome submarines in U.S. naval history. But her crew carried a simpler memory: a dark shoreline, a ticking charge, the distant rumble of a train, and the thunderous explosion that confirmed they had done the impossible. Japan never saw it coming, and history would never forget it.